Hello and welcome to Topic 2, Lecture 1. And in this, we're going to look at the perspectives of justice, Part 1. Okay, so in Topic 2, we're going to be exploring the second half of Chapter 1. And we're going to be taking a look at the 6 justice perspectives. And these 2 lectures are dedicated to summarizing these 6 justice perspectives. In this lecture, Lecture 1, we're going to look at 3 of them: the crime control perspective, the rehabilitation perspective, and the due process perspective. And then in Lecture 2, we're going to look at the remaining 3, the non-interventionist perspective, restorative justice, and equal justice perspectives. Now, this week, you will have an online discussion, and on that online discussion, you are going to be assigned one of the 6 criminal justice perspectives. And then you will use what you've learned from the textbook and the lecture and apply these concepts to an assignment that is in the discussion. And so the discussion this week is dedicated to applying these concepts. Now, I do want to draw to your attention that I want you to make sure to both watch the lecture and read the textbook, because while the lecture is a summary of these 6 perspectives, the textbook goes into much more detail and depth of coverage. So make sure that you read the textbook as well before you do the discussion, and also before you take the reading quiz. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So while you're learning about the criminal justice perspectives, I want you to keep a couple of things in mind. And one of the things to keep in mind is that, when it comes to the criminal justice system, that regardless of the perspective, that there's a broad goal of the criminal justice system that all of the perspectives share. And that broad goal is that the purpose of the criminal justice system is social control. And what that means is that, we have a criminal justice system in order to maintain safety and order by preventing behavior that threatens society, right? And so, when you live in any society, it's important that when you leave your house in the morning, or you go to work, or you come home at night, that you're not living in a community or in a society where there's a lot of dangerous behavior that's going on. One of the goals of living in any society is making sure that safety and order is maintained. And so, all these perspectives agree that it's important to maintain safety and order. Where the disagreement comes about is how to best achieve that goal. What's the best way to achieve safety and order? And how best to achieve this goal differs depending on the criminal justice perspective and the beliefs that people have about criminal justice in general. And so when you read these different perspectives, they disagree on what is the best way to prevent threatening behavior. One of the perspectives we're going to be learning about in this lecture is the crime control perspective. And, from their perspective, the best way to prevent crime or threatening behavior is to be really harsh, right? That when a person commits a crime, you punish them harshly, and it sort of sends a message to others within that society. Other perspectives think that the way you prevent threatening behavior is you reduce opportunities for threatening behavior because you give people other alternatives, So rather than engaging in theft or crime or, robbery, burglarizing people's house, you make sure that they can have an income from a non-criminal means, like have a job, get a good education. That's the best way to prevent crime. And so there's disagreement among the different perspectives regarding what's the best way to prevent threatening behavior. There's disagreement about which behaviors actually pose a threat. And so, some perspectives think that, any sort of antisocial behavior is threatening. And so an antisocial behavior such as using drugs or selling drugs or prostitution, gambling, maybe even drinking, they may say that poses a threat to the community, and that kind of behavior should be criminalized and punished. Others say, look, there's, not all antisocial or all sort of like behavior is, threatening. Take prostitution, for example. I mean, what's threatening about prostitution? One could argue. You could say somebody wants to make money by selling what one of their skill sets. They're good at having sex, and somebody needs sex, and so they buy it. And where's the harm in that? So you're going to see that there's disagreements on terms of what behaviors pose threats, and also to what extent are we willing to go to maintain safety and order. How much money do we want to spend? How many cops do we need on the street to achieve these goals? How much money do we want to spend on corrections? And are those things even effective? And so keep those in mind in terms of when you're learning about these different perspectives, because the perspectives on justice help answer these questions. And given the complexity of criminal justice, and thinking about crime and punishment and why people commit crimes, no one view dominates. I think when you're learning about these 6 perspectives, you're going to find yourself saying, oh, you know what? There's some really good points that this perspective makes, but there's really good points that this perspective, another perspective, makes as well. So keep all of that in mind, that there's no one right perspective. All the perspectives have something interesting to offer in terms of understanding criminal justice in the United States and beyond. I wanted to draw your attention to this chart that is on page 30 in your textbook. It's a concept summary chart, and it's just a handy little wheel of the different perspectives that we're going to be discussing in these 2 lectures. So equal justice, non-intervention, crime control. So it's a good handy sort of tool to take a look at to refresh your memories on the concepts before you take the quizzes. All right, so let's take a look at perspective 1. The crime control perspective. And I think it's fair to say that the crime control perspective is the dominant perspective in the United States today. All right, usually when I start teaching the crime control perspective, I start with this quote from James Q. Wilson, who's oftentimes known as the father of the crime control perspective, to get us thinking about some of the values and assumptions that the crime control perspective brings to the table. And so what I'm going to do is I will read through this quote. And then what I want you to do, and this is what we would do if we were in a face-to-face classroom together, so we can mimic this in an online environment. So once I read the quote, I want you to pause the video, and I want you to get out, a piece of paper where you're taking notes, and I want you to just basically sort of translate this quote into your own words. Like, what is James Q. Wilson trying to communicate with this quote? And what are some of the assumptions that he has? Like, basically, what does this quote mean and how might it relate to the crime control perspective? So let's go ahead and read it. Then you can pause, and then we'll come back together and talk about it. So here's the quote. Wicked people exist. Nothing avails except to set them apart from innocent people. And many people, neither wicked nor innocent, but watchful, dissembling, and calculating of their chances, ponder our reaction to wickedness as a clue to what they might profitably do. Okay, so pause the tape and translate it into your own words, and then come back. Hey, welcome back. Okay, so let's talk about what this means and how you might have translated it into your notes. So what James Q. Wilson is saying is that there are different categories of people, sort of like 3 groups of people. He says that wicked people exist and nothing avails except to set them apart from innocent people. And so basically that's one of the assumptions that he makes. One of the assumptions is that there are some people that are just born wicked, born evil, right? There's just, they're bad actors. And they're so bad, they're so evil, and they do such harm that there's nothing you can do except to get them out of society, right? To get them away from the rest of society. And he also makes an assumption that when he says set them apart from innocent people, it basically means that there are some people that are on the opposite end of the spectrum. Some are evil, but some are just born like good. They're innocent. They would never engage in a crime, right? That they would, they would follow the rules, they would follow the law. And even if maybe their kids were starving, they would say, no, I'll never commit an evil act of stealing, right? They're innocent, they're pure. And we got to make sure that we keep the wicked people away from them. But then he talks about a third category. And he says, and many people, and this is what makes up the bulk of our society, they're neither wicked nor innocent, but watchful, dissembling, and calculating of their chances. So I don't know, probably most of us aren't in this class evil. Probably most of us are not innocent, right? But probably most of us are in that category. We're sort of sitting around and we're like, hey, how are they, when people engage in bad acts, what happens to them? You're dissembling. You're sort of like, you're disguising yourself as a good person, but you're like, if I'm given the opportunity, I might engage in a crime. And you're kind of calculating your chances. You're like a rational actor, right? You're like, well, can I get away with it? So he says that, and many people, neither wicked nor innocent, but watchful, dissembling, and calculating of their chances. They ponder our reaction to wickedness as a clue to what they might profitably do. And, so that's the bulk of us, like that we are going to say, hey, what do we do with wicked people? How do we treat them? How are they punished? Can I get away with it if I engage in a wicked act? And if you look around society, you're like, man, wicked people are treated really harshly. Like they get in big trouble and they're oftentimes caught, right? And they're caught quickly and swiftly. You're like, shoot, I'm not going to engage in any wicked behavior. But if you look around and you're like, hey, people are doing really bad things and nothing's really happening to them. They're oftentimes not getting caught. They're not getting harsh punishments. I'm going to, do a cost-benefit analysis and I might engage in that wicked act. So that quote from James Q. Wilson gives us a lot of insight into what are some of the major assumptions of the crime control perspective. And so the main focus of the crime control perspective is to prevent crime through criminal sanctions. In other words, that if you, like the point of the criminal justice system is to prevent threatening behavior, to prevent crimes from taking place. And the best way that you do that is that there's a penalty for disobeying the law. You get in trouble for doing that. They say the reason, why do people commit crimes from the crime control perspective? As that quote that we just looked at, that people commit crimes because they engage in irrational calculus. And that was the big contribution that James Q. Wilson made to our understanding of crime in the United States. He basically said that criminals are like, the vast majority of criminals are like everybody, most people in society. They engage in a cost-benefit analysis, and they say, what are the benefits from engaging in the crime? What are the costs associated with it? And if the costs are greater than the benefits, then I'm not going to engage in the crime. But if the benefits are greater than the cost, I'm going to engage in the crime. And basically, you're rational actors. You're asking the question, what can I get away with? From this perspective, what's the best way to prevent crime? Well, the best way to prevent crime is to make sure that those who commit crime, that they are caught and dealt with harshly. And so the best way to prevent crime from the crime control perspective is that you want to make sure that the response to crime is swift, certain, and severe. And so what that means is that you want there to be a close relationship to committing the crime and getting and swiftly getting punished for it, right? That you want to say, this is what happens to criminals, they get punished, and that happens swiftly, so that you just sort of don't forget about that relationship to what happened to those who committed crimes. You want to have a high level of certainty. When people commit crimes, you have to communicate that you're most likely going to get apprehended. You're not going to get away with it. You're going to get caught. And when you do get caught, you're going to be punished severely. And so, as I noted, that the crime control perspective is really the perspective that has dominated public policy in the United States, criminal justice policy in the United States. 3 strikes and you're outlaws, mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing, lots of cops on the street. That's crime control perspective, because you want to, be able to apprehend wrongdoers. Those are all part and parcel of the crime control perspective. And the crime control perspective, in terms of swiftness, they want to get rid of legal roadblocks. And so a good example of that might be, getting rid of the exclusionary rule. What the exclusionary rule is that if law enforcement engage in an illegal search and they get contraband from that search, it's inadmissible in court. That's what the exclusionary rule is. Well, the crime control perspective is like, nah, we don't need the exclusionary rule. You know what? That a lot of people who are criminals, that when they're, that when we collect evidence on them, that clearly indicates that they are responsible for the crime, we can't, use it because maybe the search didn't follow the letter of the law. So people get away with stuff. And so they're like, hey, remove the legal roadblock. Maybe you don't need to read people their Miranda rights, maybe that you don't need the exclusionary rule, etc., because those roadblocks stand in the way of swift, certain, and severe justice. Okay, the next perspective we're going to look at is the rehabilitation perspective. And on that last slide, it kind of like went quick. I pressed the wrong button, so it sort of kind of went quickly to rehabilitation perspective. But I just wanted to say that going back to crime control model, there are a lot of criticisms about the crime control model. So keep those in mind. One of the, major criticisms is that a lot of people who engage in crime are impaired, that they're not capable of engaging in a rational cost-benefit analysis. They might be on drugs, they might have a mental illness, they might have alcoholism, some sort of substance abuse, and they're not capable of engaging in a cost-benefit analysis. And also that, we have a lot of severe punishments, as I noted in the last slide, yet incarceration rates keep going up, and in some instances, crime continues to go up, regardless of the severe penalties. And so there are criticisms of the crime control perspective. And so I want you to keep them in mind as we move on to the rehabilitation perspective. All right, so let's take a look at the rehabilitation perspective. Now, the rehabilitation perspective actually preceded or came before the crime control perspective. And so the crime control perspective really comes into dominance in the 1980s and 90s in the United States and continues on today. And in many ways, it was a reaction to the rehabilitationist perspective because people felt that the rehabilitationist perspective didn't really do an effective job of addressing crime in the United States. So let's look at some of the main assumptions of the rehabilitationist perspective. From the rehabilitation perspective, what they think the main focus of the criminal justice system should be, or just the main focus in general, is addressing the social and economic conditions that cause crime. And that they think that another main goal of the criminal justice system is to create, treat, and care for people who commit crimes. From this perspective, the rehabilitationists feel that the reason that people commit crimes is because something's wrong with them, that they're sick and they need to be treated. That they say that people commit crimes because they have mental health problems, that they suffer from substance abuse, alcohol addiction, drug addiction, and that's why they engage in criminal behaviors. Unlike the crime control perspective that says that criminals are rational actors and they're able to do cost-benefit analysis in determining whether to commit a crime, rehabilitationists don't agree with that. They say that some people are just sick and that's why they commit crimes, because they're not in their right mind. They also think that why people commit crime is because it is a reflection of the inequality that we have within a society or within a community. And so that, they basically say that crimes are an expression of the frustration and anger that's created by social inequality. And so that when, people are living in a poor neighborhood, and that in poor neighborhoods, might not be as many businesses there because it's poor, you don't think there's going to be enough, economic activity to sustain your business. So it's hard to get a job in your community or in your city. And so that to get a job, you have to leave the community, and there may not be transportation to get there, and you can get really frustrated about that. People get frustrated when they live in neighborhoods that are really poor and disorganized, and they get hopeless and frustrated, and they're just like, what's the point of following the rules? So they might engage in crime. And also, even if you are trying to do the right thing, like get an education, in order to get a job, you might feel that the education that you get in a poor community is not as good as you might get in a more wealthy community. And so even though you got your high school diploma, that it doesn't like enable you to go to college. It didn't set you up to succeed in college. And so you get frustrated, and then that frustration and anger plays itself out in antisocial criminal behavior. For the rehabilitation perspective, the best way to prevent crime is to address the conditions that cause crime. Their attitude is sort of like, it's like, you can either pay now or pay later. You can either invest now in providing treatment for people with mental illness, providing job opportunities, economic development, investing in communities, investing in education. You can do that now and pay for it, because then that is going to create conditions that are less likely to produce, criminals, right? Or you can pay later. You're going to pay one way or the other. If you don't invest, right? If you don't invest in treatment, if you don't invest in education and job training, then people are going to turn to crime, and that you're going to end up paying for that later. And it can actually be more costly, because the cost of law enforcement and the cost of prosecution and the courts and the cost of corrections is mightily high. And so they're basically like, let's pay now rather than waiting and paying later by addressing the conditions that cause crime. And they also think the best way to prevent crime is to treat the offender, particularly if the offender has a mental health or a substance abuse or an anger, impulse control problems. Now, just as there were criticisms with crime control perspective, there are criticisms of the rehabilitation perspective. One of the criticisms is that a lot of people grow up in poor neighborhoods and don't turn to crime, right? So how are those conditions, are they really, does economic and social inequality actually produce crime? Because a lot of people grow up in inequality and are not criminals. Likewise, you can grow up in the best conditions, the richest conditions, and become criminal as well. And so that is one of the one of the many criticisms of the rehabilitationist perspective. All right, now let's turn our sights to the third perspective, which is the due process perspective. Okay, now before we talk about the due process perspective, we have to define the concept of due process. What is due process? Well, due process is the requirement that legal matters must be resolved by established rules and principles. And it's a cornerstone, it's a bedrock of living in a constitutional democracy like we do in the United States. And so, I teach a class on civil liberties, and we spend, a large chunk of our time in that class learning about the due process. So some examples of due process as it relates to the criminal justice system is that there are certain rules that are followed, that are established in the Constitution and beyond. Rules such as a search and seizure, so that if you're going to search somebody, you have to have probable cause to search. If you search somebody and you don't have probable cause, then due process has been violated. That when it comes to criminal trials in the United States, there's due process. There are established rules and procedures. For one, you can't force somebody to testify against themselves in a court of law, right? So you have the right to remain silent. That you have the right to a jury trial, and there's a certain process that's followed in terms of seating jurors, etc. Okay, and so due process is that when it comes to legal matters, you have to follow the rules and procedures that are established by law. And so the main focus of the due process perspective is procedural fairness. It is basically applying all of the civil liberties that are associated with procedural fairness, to bring those to bear when it comes to the criminal justice system in the United States. And so, those who abide by the due process perspective, that they want to make sure that that searches are based on probable cause and that the legal procedures for searches are covered. They would be supportive of reading people their rights at the point of arrest. They would be against being pressured to give up your constitutional right to a jury trial by encouraging people to plead guilty. They would be, make sure that people get an appeal, at the end of a trial to make sure that all of the rules and procedures were followed. They also want to make sure that there's not discrimination, that it doesn't matter, that due process doesn't apply only to rich people. It doesn't only apply to those who've committed serious crimes. It doesn't only apply to white people, right? That it applies to all people, right? Regardless of your income level, regardless of your race or gender, regardless of your race. And so that's the main focus in terms of that the criminal justice system should be governed by due process. From their perspective, why do people commit crimes? Well, on one hand, they're not really concerned about what causes crime. They're like, crime takes place, and that those who have been accused of crime need to have due process applied and followed. However, they do say that that if the criminal justice system does not follow the established rules and principles, if they don't follow the rule of law, if they don't follow the civil liberties of those who are accused of crimes, that raises a lack of trust in our government, in our society, and in our criminal justice system. And that, that when you don't trust the criminal justice system to follow the rules, people are like, why should I follow the rules? Because there's a social contract. We follow the rules, and those who don't follow the rules get punished. And those who work in the criminal justice system should also get punished if they don't follow the rules. And so that lack of trust can be the cause of social disorder and not, taking laws seriously. So why is due process perspective so concerned with the vigorous protection of the rights of the accused? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One reason is that due process provides the necessary checks on the power of the state. As I always say to my students in both this class and in my civil liberties class, the state is mighty, the individual is weak, right? That the state, when you're accused of a crime and you're charged by the state has a lot of resources to bring. It has lawyers, it has courtrooms, it has a lot of resources that it can take to bear upon an individual that's accused of the crime. And those who are accused of crimes are among the weakest of individuals, right? A lot of times we're like, yeah, you got your freedom of speech rights because everybody has those rights. But, when it comes to people accused of crimes, you're like, yeah, maybe they did something wrong anyways. Maybe they are guilty. So they don't really deserve their rights, even if that guilt has not been proven. And so that's why our framers of the Bill of Rights, dedicate nearly half of the Bill of Rights to protecting the rights of the criminally accused, because they know that the state is mighty and can do great harm to somebody accused of a crime. And also society might be less robust in terms of protecting the rights of the criminally accused. Also, from the due process perspective, they argue that it's a greater crime to punish the innocent than to let the criminal go free. Because there's a cost associated with letting a criminal go free because due process wasn't followed. But for somebody who didn't commit a crime to actually then be greatly harmed by being incarcerated or maybe even put to death, that is such a huge problem within a society if those who didn't commit crimes are actually punished, that we have to do everything to make sure that we protect the innocent from being falsely accused. And also when somebody is found guilty and when somebody is sentenced, even if that sentence is death, if we follow due process, that we have great confidence in the fact that that person was in fact guilty as charged, okay? And we know that innocent people are convicted of crimes. Just ask the Innocence Project and dig into that a little bit more deeply if you want to learn more. Okay, that's it for the first three. Thanks for listening, and the second lecture is dedicated to the remaining three perspectives.